We just wrapped up recording this conversation, and I think what you're about to hear is one of the best discussions on the West Memphis 3 case. Julia Cowley is a retired FBI profiler. Every time I talk with her, I walk away learning something new, especially when my opinion is different than hers. And then we've got the captain from True Crime Garage, who is truly an expert on the case. And he's the one who's been pushing me for a long time to really dig deep into the West Memphis 3 case. The great thing about this conversation is no matter where you stand, whether you believe the West Memphis 3 are guilty or innocent, you're going to enjoy something about this conversation. Lots of angles, lots to think about. I hope you enjoy it. Julia Cowley is a retired FBI agent and behavioral profiler with a 22-year career investigating violent crime, public corruption, and civil rights cases. She now hosts a Consult podcast where she and other retired actual profilers analyze case files and offender behavior. Her team at the Consult podcast recently finished up a series on West Memphis 3, and she also did a great job going on the Prosecutors podcast to share her insights. The captain is a co-host of True Crime Garage, one of the most popular true crime podcasts with millions of downloads worldwide. Alongside his partner, Nick, he has spent years breaking down high-profile cases and cold cases with a mix of detailed research and open-ended discussion that keeps listeners engaged. True Crime Garage has also covered the West Memphis 3 case extensively, bringing attention to key details, alternative theories, and the ongoing debate around guilt and innocence. Yeah, so I'll give you my background, and why I brought you two here is I watched the Paradise Lost documentary when I had HBO way back in the day. And of course, the visuals at the beginning and showing these young kids that were killed. I'm like, what the heck? How are they showing this? And I kind of just always stuck. And then I watched Paradise Lost 2 a few years later. Always been aware of it. It's way before I started a YouTube channel or anything. And then just, kind of hear things about some of the case updates and when they got released and look into it. And then I guess it was Captain's fault. He told me like, oh, I should look into it because there's this Callahan website where it has all the case files.
Used it for most everything, I think. I mean, I read all the books and saw all the documentaries as well, and I listed those because I did draw information from those. But for the most part, going through the Callahan website, I think is great because rather than relying on somebody else who's read documents to tell me what their interpretation is of those documents, you can go in there and see it for yourself. And certain things that we would want to see in the work that we do are initial police reports, the crime scene sketches, photographs, and autopsy reports, things like that. And then initial interviews. I think part of the problem with Callahan website is that there's so much there that it can lead people down these different rabbit holes, and it just becomes a bunch of noise. And so for us, we just really stuck to the basics.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important website because, well, and I apologize for getting you into this case, but I've always respected the way you look at things and the way you handle yourself. So I thought, well, Nick's tired of talking to me about this case, so maybe Fig will. But you didn't have a thought on it, and so then I was really upset that day, and now you have thoughts on it, and you sent me back down the rabbit hole as well. But when I'm looking at a case, I don't like this idea of, well, what was only presented at trial. And I think that's what the Callahan website gives us, is information that was not presented at trial. Because if that's evidence, I think sometimes in these cases there's evidence and some people just are dismissive of that evidence because it wasn't brought to trial. But that doesn't mean it's not evidence, if that makes any sense.
Right. And I was happy that I could even see the court files and then, things that weren't allowed in court on top of that. So, it's always good to go to the source. Of course, nothing's like actually being at the crime scene. So as Julia would know, I've never been to a crime scene and actually interviewing the people or being there. But this is, to me, the next best thing, at least having some of the information as close to verbatim. But there's nothing like being there and actually talking to people.
Yeah, but Fig, as a profiler, I'm not going to the crime scenes anymore. I'm not doing the interviews anymore. I'm reviewing files the way someone would go on to Callahan and review a case file. It's very different, your role as a profiler versus your role as the actual investigator or the part of the team that goes to the crime scene and processes it. So I just want to clarify. So a lot of what you did in reviewing the file is exactly what we would do as profilers, just review the file. And if the crime scenes still exist or look the same, we would travel to them, but it's certainly not an active crime scene anymore.
Do you think there would be some benefit there to actually seeing it?
If there hasn't been like significant changes to a crime scene, like the area still looks the same, there's always a benefit to visiting a crime scene, I think. For me, always.
Yeah.
You don't always have that luxury, though.
Right. So sometimes you do the best you can. Now, Julia, my first question for you is, so what made your team, and you could kind of give us a little background on who's on your team, the consult team, what made you guys decide to hop into the West Memphis 3 cases? Yeah. What got you there?
Yeah. Well, for the most part, I pick the cases that we do. I don't pick all of them, but this was a case that I wanted to do. Just like you, I watched the Paradise Lost trilogies. I was interested in the case. I've read all the books, studied the case, and I just really wanted to hear what my colleagues thought, because this was not a case that we ever worked on when we were in the BAU. And there's two of us on the show that know the case well, and the other two did not. So it was really good to talk with them, completely fresh perspectives. And another reason was it was one of our most requested cases from our listeners. And as you know, Fig, I like to do lesser known cases, but the higher profile cases let us reach a broader audience and talk about profiling and kind of set expectations as to what it actually is and what it really can do and what it can't do.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, out of the 4 individuals, did you guys all come to the same conclusion?
On some major things, yes. So on some other things, we had some diverging opinions. Very slight, but that always tends to happen. We're not always going to agree on everything, but there are certain things in the case that I think we felt pretty strongly about. We all agreed. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Captain, so why has your wifey banned you from speaking about the West Memphis 3 case? Because when we talk about it, like, if we talk on the phone, you have to hide if we start talking about West Memphis 3. So your significant other can't hear you. What's going on there?
No, I'm allowed to talk about the case. I'm not allowed to talk about the case to her.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not allowed to watch anything about the West Memphis 3 at night because she got tired of waking up in the morning and I was still up pacing around. I don't know if you ever seen the movie A Few Good Men.
Yeah.
But I like to carry around a baseball bat and pace in circles in my living room and try to solve crimes that haven't been solved yet. If it's not West Memphis 3, it's JonBenet Ramsey or Brian Schaefer, or any of the other ones that are technically unsolved.
Well, what is it about the case so that keeps you up at night?
I think it's because I can't come up with an answer. With a lot of cases, I can go, well, I lean towards somebody's guilt or innocence. And this one, it's like I've been sitting on this fence for a long time. And I think if somebody heard me talking about the case, I bring up a lot of the things that I think point towards their guilt, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way I lean. I'm really on the fence. It's like my brain won't make a decision, and it really bothers me that my brain won't make a decision.
Well, I think I learned this from Julia too, when she talked about how serial killers in particular will keep things to themselves. Their deepest thoughts, where they won't tell everything, just what they want to share. So that made me kind of realize that we're not always going to have all the answers. We can't learn everything that we want to learn, and accepting that kind of made it easier for me. So going through this process of going through this case, I'm like, okay, I know a lot more than I knew, but still, yeah, I don't know everything. I wouldn't bet my life either way. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Julia?
Well, I feel like once, and this was like this at the BAU, it's like this now when we do the show. Once we tackle a case that there are a lot of questions about, I feel like at the end, even if we don't solve the case, and I always have to point out profiling does not identify offenders and it does not solve cases. But I feel that when I get at the end of an analysis, I feel pretty good and at peace with my understanding of that case. And I feel that way with this case now. And I always had some opinions about the case, but now having been able to sit down with my colleagues and talk it through and go through the evidence, I feel like, okay, I feel like I have a good understanding of the biggest questions that I did have. And then I can kind of move on from a case.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm working on part 3, and in part 3 of my series that I'm doing is I'm making a case on why they're innocent and doing a case for why they're guilty. So I just like challenging both sides of it. And I was even on Callahan last night looking up new things where, yeah, I think opinions, well, they do. And I mean, it's science. They change based off of the more data and information you have. So with a little bit of data, I'm going to have one opinion, but the more data that I get in, I could start making a more refined opinion. So I definitely think that's why I wouldn't answer when Captain asked me, I don't know, a year ago, what are my thoughts on it? I was like, I have too many questions. Like I don't know. I don't know enough to even have a relatively educated opinion on it. Even though I watched I watched the documentaries, but there's still so much left out. There had been things left out.
Can I ask Julia a question?
Absolutely.
What were your biggest questions, if you can remember what they were going into the case?
Number one question was it more than one offender? Number 2, what was the motive? Number 3, and this goes to motive, what were the actual injuries that they suffered? And number 4 was the concealment, portions of the concealment, including the tying and the removal of the clothes, practical or personal? So those are some of the questions I wanted to answer. And then to kind of go back to what both of you are saying, like about trying to determine, okay, are they guilty? Are they innocent? That was not our goal. That's what most people who cover the case, that is their goal. And I understand why it's the goal. We're not looking at it like, trying to prove somebody's innocent, trying to prove that somebody's guilty. That's not what we're doing. We're just going in, doing the profile, and just seeing what comes out of it, as opposed to trying to say, okay, here's all the evidence for their guilt. Here's all the evidence for their innocence. And I think I only mentioned the defendants' names maybe once through our 3-part episode. We didn't really focus on that. We focused on the crime scene. We focused on the autopsies. We focused on victimology.
Yeah, so I'm on my list here. Number 6 topic is 1 offender or 3. How do you weigh physical evidence from the scene, like 3 different knots, the autopsy findings of 3 distinct weapons, or reports that multiple people were seen near the crime scene, versus kind of the stats, the data? Do I consider these other things, or is it very isolated? Like, well, this tells me this, and then at the end, maybe I'll put isolated pieces together into one whole. Or I know what's the process there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, physical evidence is important, but you have to make sure that you understand and you're interpreting that physical evidence accurately. So, for example, yes, there were different knots. There were basically 2 different knots. They were the square knots and variants of a half hitch. So that certainly take that into consideration. Whether or not there were 3 distinct weapons, I disagree with that. I don't think anyone can say how many weapons were used. They don't even know what weapon was used. When I looked at the injuries to the victims' heads, it's definitely blunt force trauma. It's likely a smooth object. Now, at prosecution, sticks and branches were presented as possible murder weapons. That's possible. My view of their injuries, too clean to be done with a branch. I think it was a smooth, cylindrical type of object, at least. But the most we can say is they have blunt force trauma. We cannot say how many different weapons were used, nor could the medical examiner or any detective. So to say we have 3 distinct weapons, I don't think that was proven. So you really have to take into, okay, what can we prove? And not what we're just assuming. And I just don't think we can say that. And then you have, injuries that were interpreted as potential knife injuries, which, modern day experts are now saying are animal predation. I looked at the autopsy photos. It's classic animal predation to me. I don't know how it was really misinterpreted to begin with, but when we all looked at it, and we all had significant experience in homicides, we all came to the same conclusion. I want to say we all reviewed the case separately and independently, and then came together to talk about it. And that was our interpretation of the injuries. I mean, some of those injuries, especially like to Stevie's face. I mean, I've seen that exact thing happen. This sounds horrible, but when a pet eats an owner's face, that's what it looks like. And so you have to just make sure you're interpreting that physical evidence accurately. And then, I would put significant amount of weight into the physical evidence at a scene. And then reports of multiple people, you certainly have to take that into consideration. I think this is going to go into one of your next questions. When it comes to eyewitness interviews or eyewitness testimony, I give that very little weight. That is my experience. I think there's a lot that depends on it. It depends on how well did that eyewitness know who they were witnessing, how soon after the crime were they interviewed, did they have interactions, like all of that comes into play. But eyewitness testimony is one of the weakest forms of evidence. So
my limited understanding of reviewing autopsies, I did look at it. I guess where I was getting stuck was post-mortem wounds or not, seeing that the injuries, they were bleeding, so they were still alive on some of the major wounds. So for the story to be that it was animals that ate them once they were dead and they're thrown in the water, and then animals, that didn't jive for me. But I don't understand enough. I'm not a medical expert, but it seemed like they were bleeding out of their wounds. They're still alive while some of these significant injuries happened.
Some of them, yeah, but most of them, the majority of them, means that's the thing. We can't say with 100% certainty there wasn't a knife used, but the majority of the injuries that were originally attributed to a knife, they are what I believe are animal predation. They were post-mortem. When a victim gets pulled out of the water, I mean, aquatic life does quite a number on victims. I've seen multiple people pulled out of the water, and you obviously have different kinds of animal life in different regions of the country, but you get crabs or crawdads or turtles, like in this case, suspected animals in this case. I mean, they do a number on a body and can do it pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's one of the. Yeah, go ahead, Captain.
I was just going to say, I always looked at two things, that it was probably both. So there's some injuries that took place during the crime, and then obviously injuries that took place after the crime. So I think sometimes people are too quick to say, well, the animals did all this. But I think because we don't the luminol testing to me doesn't seem clear, or if they did it, was it done correctly? And I think if we had a better idea of the luminol test, we'd have a better idea of how severe these wounds were before they were put into the water.
Yeah, the luminol test was a week after the crime, and it rained in between there. So,
now I've processed a crime scene where that actually happened. A guy was beaten and he fell on the grass. It was a flat surface, and he was there for a little bit of time before he was recovered. And we went out and luminol the grass about a week later after rain, and we still could see where his head was. And it really just comes down to, can you interpret, a false positive versus a real positive? And I think with experience, you can kind of tell the difference. Blood, if it's blood, it tends to glow for or brighter for a significant period of time, much longer than if it were, something that's creating a false positive, like cleaning supplies or something like that. And there's also, it's also a very intense glow. So, is it possible it's false positive without being there and having seen the reaction for myself? I don't know, but it is possible to still get luminol results even under those conditions. I wouldn't completely rule them out as being, I just don't think we can put a lot of weight onto them, as both of you are saying, but I wouldn't rule it out as being impossible to have gotten those results.
All right. Anything else, Captain, that you'd like to discuss for the one offender or three offenders?
Well, no, I think the two knots actually, I think the way she is looking at the case is probably a good way to look at it, but I think it's hard not to take into account somebody telling us about the crime multiple times and how much information he gets correct.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. But I'm guessing that she leans towards it being one perpetrator.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I feel pretty confident about that, but yeah, that's where I lean.
yeah, with the injury, I guess the final thought, and everyone could have a final thought on it, is yeah, with the knife being used, when I was up in the air, but what kind of did it for me, I'm like, oh yeah, a knife was used when a knife was used to cut one of the shoelaces in half. So I'm like, well, there was a knife present, so this person is beating him, blunt force trauma, and he didn't use that knife. So there's certain things for this case for me where I'm like on the fence, and there's something that pushed me a little bit. And I'm not saying it makes me 100% certain, but I'm like, all right, instead of 50-50, I'm 55-45 now. But that there was a knife being present at the crime scene, that kind of made me think a knife was used. And then just the different sizes of sticks and branches, if those were used. I saw some markings because unfortunately I looked at the autopsy photos too, because I wanted to see, and just seeing the different sizes. But yeah, it's hard from a picture, and it could have been caused by different things. Could have been caused a few hours earlier, or the boys hitting each other with sticks. These are just some of the bruising, some of the marks that I saw. So it's just a lot of still unknown. All right. The next question I have, and I'm 50-50 on this. I'm maybe not even. Okay, was it a premeditated murder or a thrill kill or something else? I've always had a very hard time thinking it was premeditated, and they got these boys out here, or a person did, for some satanic rituals. We talked about last time, Julia, how often these cult sacrifices happen. More like how rare they are, and they never happen. But yeah, your guys' thoughts on, I think I have Julia going first and Captain, about it being premeditated or a thrill kill or something else.
I don't like this idea, though, that and it's become a thing where people say these satanic kills or these ritualistic kills, they don't happen. Like almost every serial, let me take that back. Not every serial killer, but there is a handful of serial killers that believe that they were killing their victims so they can control them and they could be slaves in their afterlife. So I'd argue that all those killings, or maybe you could make an argument that every killing is satanic in nature, or has some kind of ritualistic thing to it. So I think it's just strange that we poo-poo that idea.
Well, I was poo-pooing it. I think satanic influenced. I like that phrase, like influenced by it. And I'll let Julia describe it. She does a way better job of it. And she's, go ahead, Julia. How you describe it?
I mean, I know what Captain is saying. Is some people are, and typically those people have mental health issues. But when we're looking at strictly a killing as a sacrifice, as a satanic sacrifice, which was how this was presented in court, I believe. Even though I'm not even sure, like, the investigators fully bought into that, but it was the motive that they had. We don't see that. Now, we see crimes with elements of Satanism. I mean, I've seen a serial killer who, painted pentagrams places with blood and things like that. So you have that, but what's the ultimate underlying motivation? And so that's what we're looking at, is the satanic part of it more to their offender characteristics, or is it to the motive? And for an actual motive, that is very rare. So I think that's the distinction. And I think Captain makes a good point about that. So, yeah.
Okay. So what are your thoughts on it being premeditated, whether it's one or three offenders?
Yeah, we came to the conclusion we didn't think it was premeditated, and it was our opinion that the blows to the head were the first injuries that were inflicted. And then the use of the shoelaces were, obviously the killer didn't bring that with them. Now, did the killer bring a murder weapon? Possibly. I mean, they didn't find it with certainty. I mean, I guess it could have been one of the branches, but we don't know. But did he have the murder weapon? But we lean toward it not being premeditated and something getting out of hand at some point. Now, I don't want to rule out that there wasn't a premeditation to have some sort of confrontation with them in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't think it was premeditated. And one of the things that bothers me about this case is, and maybe this is more of a young boy thing as opposed to a young girl thing, but the amount of times that I've gone to a park with friends or a playground with friends, and there's a group of other boys, and maybe they're a little older, and there always was some kind of confrontation. And I believe that that's probably what happened, was there was some kind of confrontation. And then once it got out of hand, then the killers obviously took it to a extreme level.
Yeah, one thing that I found more recently, and I know some people listening to this have followed this case forever and a lot closer than me, but it's something that I saw recently, was if it was the West Memphis Three who committed this crime, I thought it was interesting that there was a witness that came forward that said they saw Damien Eccles about 3 houses behind Michael Moore at about 3 or 4 p.m. So I'm trying to, I'm so anti it's premeditated, but I'd like to think openly and like, all right, man, okay, so say it was Damien, say he saw him, but still, how did they get them in? Like, did they talk? There still needs to be more to it, but I'm just trying to take in new information and still see what I think about it. But I thought that was interesting that Damien Eccles was seen, and again, witness statements, who knows if it was the right day or, it was a few days after the murders, but still, Yeah, witness testimony, and there was no observation that Damon actually talked to the boy at all, that he was just seen walking a few houses behind him. So another interesting thing, thanks to Callahan.
Well, one of my issues with this case is the amount of kids that talked about these like little confessions that either Damien gave or Jason gave or Jesse gave. They end up in the files, but they all seem to, when it came time to go to trial, they all seem to just disappear. And I think Ron Lax, if you watch the movie, the Reese Witherspoon movie, I think it's actually really fitting that they make Ron Lax one of the main characters, because he's not talked about enough when people look into this case, and not the way Julia's looking into this case, but if you're looking into it, are these 3 teenage boys guilty of the crimes? Well, there would have been a lot more people testifying against them if Ron Lax wasn't involved.
Yeah, because it was who it was Buddy Lucas and I think William Jones, people who went and then they said, oh, we just talked to Ron Lax and we're no longer going to testify. And then they passed or failed polygraph tests that showed, I mean, it's a polygraph test, so take it for what you will, but that they were, what they told the police the first time was the truth. And then, yeah, they weren't. So yeah, it's interesting. That the Ron Lax part of it, keeping people silent.
If you just go back and you look at, and this is what our role is go back and look at what actually happened there. You have somebody, an offender or offenders, who went to an extreme effort. This is one of the most significant efforts I've ever seen to conceal a crime scene. You had 3 victims. You had them undressed. You had them tied up. You had their clothes hidden in the mud as well. You had them submerged. You had the bank swept off to make it look like. I mean, it's extreme effort in to go and brag to anyone, and I think he did. I do think a lot of those statements he made are probably true. That is not in line at all with what this offender did at the crime scene. And so I do question the motive behind him making those comments to people, if he made them all. I'm not saying he made them all, but I think he at least made a few. But the offender who did this, if we're profiling that offender, we say they are not confessing to people. They're not going around bragging about this. They made too much of an effort to hide it, an extreme amount of effort that put them at much greater risk. This was a high priority for this person to hide this crime. There is no way I could see an offender
but
just
does your job
casually. Yeah, but go ahead.
But does your job become harder with, look, if you're profiling a 30-year-old man or a 40-year-old man, maybe that would be easier, but does it make it, I understand that you're just looking at the evidence, so you're profiling it as a sense of we're not picking a character. But if it's a stepfather, then they're more set in their ways or their actions. And so the fact that this crime could have been committed by 3 teenage boys, does it change in the sense of like a teenage boy is a lot more unpredictable? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I see what you're saying. And it could change. Is it possible that this offender or offenders went to the extreme effort of hiding the bodies, and then because they're impulsive teenagers, one went around and talked about it? That is always possible. Like, this is not 100%. But and then when, kind of going back to, is this an impulsive teenager? Maybe. But what you have is somebody who can engage in extreme violence and then flip it immediately. Okay, game on. I got to clean this mess up. And that's what you see here. And it was, you have sort of this out of control piece of it, extreme violence, extreme temper, and then somebody who can immediately get control of their emotions and clean it up. So to me, that leans towards maybe not quite a younger offender, maybe slightly older. But again, this is all based on probabilities, and any number of things could change that, as you point out, Captain.
Yeah, I think that's what bothers me about this case is because if it is the West Memphis Three that committed these crimes, then to me it's harder to understand because you have three different personalities. So when I've talked to some detectives about this, they go, okay, well, so let's just assume it's them. Okay, Jesse felt bad about it. So he was never going to be able to stay quiet because he felt bad about it. And he wasn't as involved as the other two. So he can't keep his mouth shut because because they're all three different personalities. And maybe he's the type where I have to confess because once I confess, I feel better about it. And then Damien's the braggadocious one, but when it comes time to save himself, he will then shut his mouth. And then maybe Baldwin is the type of individual that is never going to admit that he did anything. And I think I'm so glad I'm talking to you because you can maybe fix my brain. But it's like the two knots, like when people go, well, there's three knots, so therefore that means there's three killers. And you look more into it and you're like, well, I think you can make the argument that there's really just two knots. Well, then based off of Jesse's confession, he leaves before all that stuff takes place. And so there wouldn't have been three killers at the time that the knots were being tied. So there would only be two different kinds because there are only two killers left. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does make sense. And what I think happens is that we're trying to fit this into three people. And when people do that, they're like, well, there's three knots or two knots or Jesse left. And so I try not to do that. I try very hard not to do that. And so what I see, and this is going again back to one or more offender, and this is what we talked about on our show, we see an evolution. Where we believe Michael Moore was probably tied first. You see an evolution of the offender who didn't plan a homicide, but now has got to clean it up. And he starts tying one boy one way, and then he's adjusting a little bit as he goes on until he has perfected the way he wants to tie the boys. And so you have that variation. But across the board, what I see more of is consistency. So when you talk about maybe three distinct personalities, which is in some ways what you do have when you have the three defendants, you do have three very distinct personalities, as you just described. I don't see three distinct personalities at this scene. I see one, and I see a consistent personality throughout. You have like these variations, which is normal because you hadn't planned for it. You're under stress. You're adjusting as you go along. You've abandoned one way for a better way. But the rest of it, the bodies are all treated the same cause of death, the removal of the clothing, the way the clothing was discarded, the way the bodies are tied up, the way that the bodies are concealed. It's just, to me, what I see is complete consistency across the board versus, three distinct people acting. And, I know, Fig, you were wondering about, how do we ever come to a determination that there's more than one offender? And, statistically, if you have more than one victim, overwhelmingly, you have only one offender. And so as profilers, what are we looking for? Well, we're looking for pretty good evidence because the statistics are so overwhelming that we're looking for really solid evidence of two offenders, like two DNA types or things that had to have happened simultaneously. So when we look at this and we say, could one offender have done it? Yes. And therefore, statistically, it's a statistical precedent. We really just have to default to this is one offender. And so that's where I always come back to. But to your point, I don't see three distinct personalities in the commission of this crime.
No, which
Yeah.
I would
Go.
agree with you, but I think where it gets difficult for me is, and what I remind myself all the time is, I'm going to look at life, and then these crimes are a part of life, or I guess a part of life and death. But I'm going to look at everything with my tinted glasses, however, my captain tinted glasses. And so when you have an individual that is telling, that goes, hey, we did this, then I'm going, okay, because in my mind, I could never understand admitting to something that I didn't admit to, or admit to something that I didn't do. And so to me, I go, does his story make sense with what evidence we have? And there's not much of his story that I go, oh, it's not this far-fetched tale that he's weaving in my mind. And that's the part that I have a hard time getting over. Is even like, to your point, you go, well, even the concealing of the bodies, or concealing of the clothes, you could make an argument that all the knots were tied by one boy, and all the concealing of the clothes were done by the other boy, because the third boy is already gone based off of what he's told us. But I just think that there's certain things in his story that, you have, like, where how the victims were displaced, how you have two on one end and one on further down. Does that bother you at all, or?
So yes, I mean, obviously, I mean, I didn't study his confessions, and there's more than one, and I don't believe he was browbeaten, but I've listened to him and read them. The issue that I have, because if you do go through Callahan, and this is one thing I think that I got out of it, is that you had a lot of people calling in tips, and you're like, how can they have that tip if they haven't heard some leaked information? So you have to kind of think what information was out there in the public at the time. And none of us can really know that unless we were back there in that community at the time. I think Jesse heard things. I think I have real problems with his details and what he got wrong. Yes, he got some things right, but there was nothing that I saw that I said, only the killer knew this, because there were just so many things that were being said. And if you do go back, like there was one, I think somebody had called in and said, well, I gave Jason a knife. Well, how did he know that a knife was used? How did you know to even call in that tip? I mean, because he heard they were stabbed, he heard they were cut up. The story about the emasculation was going around. So I certainly, consider the confessions important. I think you can't just dismiss them and say, oh, he just has a low IQ. But I have serious questions about them. And to me, there's just nothing in there that I saw them like he just had to have been there. I didn't see anything like that. I think
The first one is when he talks about how Michael Moore runs away and he has to get him. And so then you go, okay, well, now he just explained the separation.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one that the Evan Williams bottle top that they found at the overpass, that, he said, I got sick, I threw up, and then I broke this bottle. And then his lawyer, Dan Stidham, which have a lot of issues with Dan Stidham, because he's like, if you have any thought that these boys are guilty, then you're stupid. And I'm like, no, I'm just trying to make sense of this. But you had your client, first of all, he thought his client was guilty for months. But then when your client confesses over and over and then says to you, well, I'm going to confess, and then he tells you about this Evan Williams bottle, and then the lawyer tells the prosecutors, well, if we find this bottle, then I'll believe the story. And an Evan Williams bottle is not super common. And then they find the bottle. You go, well, isn't that some proof of his story? Or there's another situation where I think there's a detective in the room with Gitchell, and the detective is like, I don't really buy this story because I was down at the crime scene, and this path that Jesse says he left doesn't exist. And then when they went back to the crime scene, the detectives looked for that exit way and realized it did exist. And then I don't know,
So yeah, there's 5 confession. One, so I went through them, and it really helps to go through them first for me. And then when I went back a second time, things that he said, like in the police ride after he was convicted, I'm like, oh, that's why he said it in the first. Like, things started coming together, and I think the first thing that jumped out at me was he was talking about he was spending all of his time with Michael Moore, and that stayed consistent, the Boy Scout. And then he said in that car ride with the police officers while she was getting transported to prison, he was describing how Jason came up to him with a knife when he was beating up Michael Moore, like, hey, I want to mutilate this one too. And Jesse wouldn't let him. Jesse said, no, you're not gonna do this one like that. And then how Jason goes back, leaves him alone, and gives him this weird look. Where then I looked at the autopsy, and yeah, Michael Moore, he wasn't stabbed, he wasn't punctured, he didn't have any puncture wounds, and he was the only boy that didn't have his genitals mutilated. One was cut off, and the other ones were injured. So to me, I was like, how would you guess that? How would you know out of 3, you're guessing which one didn't get stabbed and which one didn't get their genitals mutilated in any form? So I thought that was pretty significant that he knew that.
Wasn't that after the trial?
So yeah, then there's that, right? There's is he low
sat
IQ?
through a trial.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what did he learn from that? And is he smart enough to put everything together? But did he know that detail? Did he learn it from the trial? I don't know.
Yeah, but I think the other problem with this case, though, too, is it becomes like politics. You're on one side of the fence or on the other side of the fence. And I've tried to talk to Bob Ruff about it. And just by asking a couple questions, it becomes, well, you must think that they're guilty, so I'm going to start shouting at you. But, Bob Ruff would say to me something like, oh, well, I talked to all 3 of these boys, and these boys said they were never in the woods. The West Memphis 3 were never in those woods. And he just says something, offhanded, like that is supposed to be proof that they didn't do it. And then I can easily find clips of them talking about being in those woods. So
I'm pretty sure Damien admitted to walking through the woods.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
all 3 of them did.
Yeah, I don't, at least Damien. So they all had connections to the woods, I believe.
And I think, so one of my issues with this whole case too is there's lies, a ton of lies. Like, still to this day, 30 years later, they've created this narrative, the defense team. And there's so many holes in their narrative. And I mean, we could go through a bunch of them, but that doesn't change the fact that it's just why. Like, if I'm trying to defend somebody, to me, it's like, let's just figure out the truth. The truth will then defend us And then you don't have to remember the truth. The truth is just the truth. But like still to this day, 30 years later, they're saying Jesse was interrogated for 8 to 12 hours. It's like you can listen to on the confession tapes. He says it's like 1:30 or something like that. So it's like, where were these 8 to 12 hours that he was being interrogated and beat up and all this? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what their excuse is for all these lies. Like, we still have no alibis for three individuals. Not one of them have a credible alibi. And obviously that's not, you could chalk that up to some of what their age, right? And because they didn't have a work schedule and stuff, that maybe they didn't know exactly what they were doing. But we have but they've constantly lied about their alibis, or constantly lied about when they've confessed to people. And I just, again, because I view the world in a certain way, I'm like, they have to be lying for a reason. Just like in 2011, when they get released, I mean, part of the narrative was that basically the state offered them this deal and they took it. That's not true. The defense is the ones who offered the deal to the state. The state took it. But it's little tiny words like that that I think matter. Obviously, and not in which way you're looking at the case, but those are some of the things that I just have a hard time wrapping my head around. Or like when they said in 2011, we have evidence that would exonerate us. And the state knew this, so they had to offer us the deal. Again, they didn't offer you the deal. You offered up the deal. And when they get released, where's this evidence that exonerates them? It doesn't exist. And I don't know. And then I also just think like some of the stuff that Damien does is odd. I mean, you're on trial and Aleister Crowley becomes a part of that trial. Whether that's justified or not, it's a part of the trial. It's a part of this history. It's a part of these 3 8-year-old boys being murdered. And then, you know, what was it, 2 years ago on a podcast, he says that the 2 biggest mentors of his life were Aleister Crowley and Joel Osteen. It's almost like, and maybe he's just a piece of shit person that wants to toss this stuff up into people's faces. But I don't know. It's just, I question the confessions, and I question why the defense team and anybody that's thinks that the West Memphis 3 are completely innocent. It's like, I question the controlling of the narrative.
Julia, I was going to ask you, the way that they were tied, how it wasn't a traditional hog tie. Have you heard of any case or seen any case where people have been tied like that? And what do you think was the purpose of them being tied in that manner? That ankle to wrist, wrist to ankle, both on the same side.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on that?
So I have seen that done before in that way. And we debated this on our show. Was it purely practical to conceal the bodies because, you know, tying them like that prevents their arms from floating up to the top, and it is very practical. A couple of us felt that it looked also very sexual.
Right.
And I was one of them. So
yeah, I thought so too.
I felt that there was a sexual component to this crime in some way, shape, or form. And we also talked about whether or not they were already undressed when the offender or offenders came upon them, whether or not the offenders took off their clothes, whether or not they were forced to take off their clothes by the offenders. We could not answer that question. But I think anytime you find a victim naked, you cannot rule out a sexual motive, even if there's not a sexual assault. And then the bindings themselves looked very ritualized to me. And as we talked about it, the the people who thought it was completely practical, you know, I think we kind of came to an understanding that it might be or it might not be. So,
Well,
but that's my opinion. And it could serve a dual purpose.
and not to speak for Nick, but Nick, and I don't know if this is his theory that he believes that happened, but a theory that he has posed was that possibly the crime took place somewhere else, and this was like a practical application, because then by binding their hands and their feet that way, it almost becomes handles, so you can
Yes.
move the individuals easier.
I could see that. However, I just think if we're weighing the probabilities, and I'm going to keep coming back to that, I think they were killed where they were found, because I think
Yeah.
the logistics in transporting 3 bodies, it would most likely have to be in a vehicle and then carrying them over the pipe bridge if that's the way they went in, which I think it probably was. But in any event, whichever direction you're coming in from, I mean, that's a huge risk to an offender and the likelihood of being caught. I just think it's just most probable they were killed there. But like I said, you can't rule that out completely. But I do see the point of the practical aspect of being able to lift them up and transport them that way. There's definitely practical aspects to the way that they were tied.
I know I'm taking over, Fig, but I have so many questions.
Go ahead.
This is what happens with podcasters, Fig.
Yeah. You like to
do
talk.
you have any thoughts on the victim separation? How one was Michael Moore was further down than the other two?
So I don't know. There are a couple of thoughts that could come into play. One being that Michael ran, and that's where he ended up. Another being that they were killed down where Michael was, and I think that's where luminol may have, or presumptive tests were positive down more closer to where Michael. Correct me if I'm wrong, Fig. I remember seeing a sketch that showed the outlines. And so possibly they're all killed there, and then Michael's concealed first, and then the other 2 are moved up further for further concealment. Those are possibilities. I can't say with certainty, but I do wonder exactly. I don't know that we can say for certain where they were killed, but if you were to look at the luminol, it could suggest they were killed closer to where Michael was found. But without a confirmatory test on the luminol, we can't really rely on that.
Right.
But I also don't completely dismiss it based on my own experience with luminol.
Yeah, that's the...
See, this is why my show will never be number 1, because I never have a definitive answer. I can't say. It's always like, it depends.
Well, if you ever need another co-host that has no answers, go further. No,
well, that's more genuine, though, to pretend you have answers that no one has answers to. I get turned off by listening to people like that.
It was a hard case because, also just trying to determine, and I know you're going to get into this, Fig, about John Douglas's profile, but just trying to determine at what point their clothes were taken off, because there wasn't blood found on their clothing. And some people will insist, well, then the clothing had to be removed before they were beaten, at least. But I have seen cases where you expect that there's going to be blood on somebody's clothing, and they've been murdered, they've even been stabbed, or hit on the head, and blood isn't always where you expect it to be. Is it
like John Bonet, right? She got beat over the head, and it was internal bleeding, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this was not internal. They definitely had external injuries on their skull, but we just don't know. Is it possible that the dynamics of the interactions between the victims and the offender or offenders were such that they did not end up with blood on their clothing? Now, do I think that I mean, that is always possible. Is it probable? No, but I couldn't rule it out. But these are the things we debated. Like, you just can't say for certain that their clothes were off just because they didn't find blood on their clothing. Like, we debated all these little things about the scene that we just couldn't say with certainty. Um,
Well,
and
doesn't
that,
this isn't this crime so much more difficult to ponder or come up with answers because the victims were found in water and their clothes were found in water? I mean, is it possible that the clothes could have been soaked long enough where it would be almost impossible to find blood evidence?
yeah, I think that's possible. It was washed away. Yeah, it's entirely possible.
And then now I want to know, that brings it up. I want to know how cold the water was. Because I tell you what, one time I had a bloody nose and it got all over my shirt. And someone told me if you just put it under really cold water, the blood just comes right off. I didn't really believe it, but I did it. Had blood all over my shirt. I put it in cold water and the blood just vanished from my eye, from the visible eye. But I was like, wow.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah,
the
if
water
it's
was
still
probably pretty
wet,
warm. Yeah.
and you run it underwater, yeah, you can get rid of a stain pretty quickly.
Well, and they could have been soaking in that water for over 12 hours.
They were, yeah. I agree.
See,
Yeah.
I always wondered if the separation of the boys pointed to any evidence of the strength of the killer, meaning like that they wouldn't be able to move them as far. And I'd be curious to know how far off of the bank they were found, because I just don't believe this killer had a lot of strength. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how. I've never tried. I mean, I'm sure I've picked up my son when he was that young before. I just can't remember how heavy he was, but I mean, the killer had some strength, obviously, to wield the blows that he did and to do what he did. But I don't know how strong you'd have to be to lift them up and put them into the water. And you could probably just, if you can't lift them, drag them or push them as well, and use the gravity of the downhill part of it to help you get them into the water. So what I will say is I do think a lot of, sorry to interrupt, but just back to Captain's point, I will say there was a lot of energy. This person was probably tired afterwards. Just a lot went into this. Even though they're small and 50-pound boys, there was a lot of energy expended in this crime, I think.
Yeah.
And the crime and cleanup. See, and that's why I'm like, oh, maybe it was 3 then. There's a lot to do and a lot got done.
There is a lot to do, and it was it was pretty efficient. And again, I see consistency. And, the one thing I want to say to both of you, and particularly you, Captain, because I have no problem, and I don't think people are stupid because they have a difference of opinion on a case than I do. It doesn't bother me at all because I have had detectives. I tell this story all the time. My co-host and I, Bob and I, were giving a profile, and it did not match a lead detective's theory on a case. He was so upset with us. He stood up, took his badge off his belt, slammed it on the table, and basically screamed in front of the entire room that if we were right, he was turning his badge in, and he stormed out. And we all just sat there, just stunned. And so I've had people be really mad at me for not agreeing. And I just don't, it doesn't bother me at all. It doesn't faze me. I think discussions like this are, I mean, they keep me on my toes, and I appreciate I don't want everyone just to think like I do. And I certainly don't think people are stupid if they have a difference of opinion. That's the problem, I think, not just in true crime, but in our world. It's just like,
Yeah, there's no
We're going to
answers here in the
disagree.
back of the book, right? There's no, all right, let's check and see who was right or wrong. There's no,
Oh,
so it's
yeah.
unknown. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and we're talking about like, and Nick got to the point where anybody that believes that Richard Allen is innocent, it was really frustrating to him. And I kept on trying to explain to him that not everybody's looked at this crime as deeply as you have. They've just heard maybe tidbits. So some of it's just, there's a, ignorance there. They're not stupid. They just don't have the information. But even like with what you're saying with the consistency, again, that's where I go back to his confession, and you go, well, if he's saying this took place and then I left, there's still a possibility that you have one of the individuals. I mean, how many times have you been at, at an after party and everybody's waking up and there's one guy cleaning and the other guy's sitting around saying, wasn't that party so crazy? Man, we had a blast. And the guy's cleaning up. So I think what you're saying is, I'm not disagreeing with it. Because you're the expert, but I just feel like there's more possibilities. Am I making any sense?
Yes, perfect sense.
So I think a lot of
this case
with true crime, people don't, but I didn't either until I started looking at the Delphi case, but really learned the role of the defense side and the role of the state. And not just the role, but the defense are the loud ones. People, they're on TV, they're talking, they don't need to uncover the truth. They just need to cause reasonable doubt and bring up multiple theories. So people take a lot of what defense say as gospel because that's who they see. And a lot of times the state and the prosecution, you don't hear their side. So I thought one thing that was interesting as I was looking into this file is that there was some DNA that matched Damien. Now, not a full profile, but you don't see that anywhere. It was so hard for me to find this. I had to go from like 2008 to look at some, I don't know, a hearing or something. But reading through it, how it talked about, now again, this is not, it does not point, I think it's like it could have been like 1.2 million people. It could have been their DNA, but no one talks about this, how there's on, who was Stevie Branch on his, on the binding, there was likely a skin cell. They didn't say what it was from, but they looked at the markers of it. And I guess they were able to get markers 10, 11, 12, and, one's from the mom, one's from the dad, how they established those. And it was the problem with this DNA was a mixed sample where it had 10, 11, and 12 on there. 10 belonged to Stevie Branch, so that 10 was from him, but the markers 11 and 12, Damien has both of those, 11 and 12. So that's only two markers, but out of the two, Damien has both of those. Jesse Miss Kelly had one. Jesse Miss Kelly had the 11 marker, but 2 for 2. Now, if that kept going out and it was a better sample and, it had 20 markers and then all 20 matched, then we could say, it points to Damien, but they only had 3 available. It was a mixed sample. There was 2 that belonged to Damien, 2 out of the 2 that weren't Stevie Branch. So they could use words like, no DNA points to our clients. And it's true that amount of DNA doesn't point to it. Now, when you add that with other things, you could think more about it when you start adding other things together. But it's just something that I was looking into that, you won't hear about, and it doesn't point to Damien, but I just still thought it was interesting going through some of the, not only just the original case files, but then the 2008, then there's the 2011, 2012, and now they're doing more testing in 2025. So who knows? So have you heard about that? I think, Captain, have you heard about that? The skin cell or the DNA found on the ligature?
Yeah, and you've also talked about the blood that was found on Jesse Miss Kelly's shirt that could have matched Michael Moore's, and then the blood that was on Damien's necklace that could have matched Stevie Branch's. It's And then the other part of the confession that was weird wasn't there some fibers that they found on one of the victims that matched Jason Baldwin's mother's robe?
Yeah, the red fiber. Yeah.
And that was in one of the confessions as well, that Jesse said that they put a woman's, well, I think he said dress, but it was a robe, but they put it over the one of the victims because they wanted to make it look like a woman did the crime. I mean, obviously, with his confessions, there's a lot of stuff, the initial time that he says, the initial what they used to bind the victims. But I one of the things that I have a hard time wrapping my head around is, okay, 3 teenage boys commit this crime, but what are the chances that they didn't commit the crime, but all 3 of them confessed at some point? That drives me bonkers.
Yeah, I'm still not quite convinced about Jason, the person who said Jason. So on the fence, it's just, again, one of those unknowns. But yeah, I think Damien trolled a lot of people. I think he liked shocking people with what he said, whether he killed them or not. I'm not surprised that he said the things that he said, whether he's involved or not. Like, that just seems his personality to troll people like that. And Jason, yeah, to the behavioral thing, that's why I think what you're asking, Julia, is like, yeah, isn't it confusing when there's boys? And to me, it's also confusing where there's possibly 3 people. And of course, we have to consider that because there's one person who puts 2 other people there. And okay, so you have different behavioral styles. So doing a behavioral analysis, well, if there is multiple people, well, now you have multiple behaviors. Or if you have one who's a leader, that personality trait, and he's telling the other 2 what to do, then they're going to behave a certain way. So it seems very, very difficult where Jason has the personality and behavior type to not say anything because he wouldn't take a lie detector test. He didn't want to give up an alibi. I guess that was up to his lawyer to even present one, but he seemed quiet to me. So him confessing to this guy in jail who barely knew doesn't match up with the rest of his personality. That's why I have a hard time with it. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but that's where I'm at.
I just wonder how many cases there. I understand there's a lot of cases out there that somebody falsely confesses to, but what are the odds that 3? I mean, and just also other things, like if Jesse's making up this whole story, what are the odds that the other 2 boys that he implicates in the murders have no alibi? You know what I mean? Like, what are those? What's the odds of that? I don't know. I hate this case.
I don't have the transcript in front of me, but something that I think it was when the police officers were transporting him that stuck out was if it was them, those 3, he did say he felt set up like by the other 2, like the other 2, Damien and Jason, they had it in them. And Jesse felt like, cause he said he was drinking, it was drunk, that they kind of took advantage of him. So he wanted to make sure that they got in trouble after. That's why he's so hyped up with the Bible confession and all that, because it's like, no, I did the least amount of this. You guys talked me into this when I was, susceptible because I was drinking, and where it just seemed like he was trying so hard to make sure those 2 got in trouble, where he was trying to fill in the gaps, not that he was being led. And I think he was being led on some questions, but Brett, on the prosecutor's way he described it, made sense to me about, well, he brought up how they probably they did have an interview before this. And you could see on Callahan the interview notes, you can't hear it. It wasn't recorded. So it seemed like during that first confession that Gitchell and, was it Ridge, they're trying to get him to like, hey, you just told us when we weren't recording these things, but that's still leading him.
Right.
Oh, sorry, I was rambling.
What are your thoughts on just the confessions, Julia?
Well, like I said, I haven't studied them the way that you have. I really tried to block all of the extraneous stuff out to really do what we consider a very pure profile. But obviously
It doesn't help me at all.
I know.
Give him all the answers. He wants all the answers.
Because here's one of the things that's been driving me nuts is the genre is called true crime, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the more I look into these cases, the more I'm like, it shouldn't be called true crime. It should be called what we think we know so far. Because so many of these cases, I mean, there's evidence and then there's narrative. And it seems like narrative is very important. And I think, and that's what bothers me the most in this case, is just this narrative that has been fed to the public. And I just question, why has it been fed to the public? And it could just be, well, this is how you defend people. And this is how you defend people when we don't have certain answers. But, I thought, I was telling Fig this the other day. It's like, I love the fact that the prosecutors interviewed Dominique, which was Damien's girlfriend at the time of the murders, the one he had a child with. But it's so fascinating to listen to her interview because she's still telling lies. Like, she basically is a part of Damien's life. Then he gets sentenced, and she's still a part of his life for maybe 6 months or so, and then she moves away, and she's basically out of the picture. But her narrative, the shit that she was saying on the prosecutor's podcast, was the same bullshit that they were saying back in like 96. And it's like she didn't get the updated memo of like, no, we've changed our lies now. And it just, I don't know.
Yeah. So she said that, she was there with them during the time of the murders, but she was dropped off at 5:30 or 6 at the latest. So that didn't jive with when the boys, because they were last seen going into the woods between 6:30. So, but she says that's why she knows they didn't commit the murders, because she was with them. But she wasn't with, they were killed later. So I don't know how it makes sense. So I kind of just ignored her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, back to Captain's questions about the confessions. I mean, obviously I've talked about Jesse's confessions, and with Damien's, I wouldn't call those technically confessions, just because, they're not said under the appropriate circumstances to be considered confessions, but certainly there are some admissions that he's made, and those are under very different circumstances than Jesse's. And then
Right.
Jason's, was that a jailhouse?
Well, here's the problem. So this is okay. We'll just take this one point, and this is what drives me nuts. It's so Jason is in jail with a guy named Michael Carson. He tells Michael Carson,
Yes.
we did the crime, and this is what happened. So then Michael Carson gets out of jail. He is now back at home. He's living with his parents. Something about the West Memphis 3 comes up on TV, and he tells his dad what Jason told him. So then his dad says, well, son, we got to go to the cops. You need to tell the cops what you know. So they do. And then he ends up having to testify. Now, Ron Lax can't get him not to testify because all the other people that Ron Lax gets to not testify, they don't have like parental figures. But Michael Carson has a parental figure that says, no, you got to testify. He told you this. You told me he told you this. We told the cops this. You told the cops you're going to testify. You're going to testify. So then he testifies, and everybody says, well, he was lying and then the defense team is like, this is a jailhouse confession. Well, technically it's not, because he had nothing to gain. He was already out of prison. So what did he have to gain in return for this testimony? Nothing. And then later on, when they made their documentary, they hint at the idea that Michael Carson has recanted his statements. which is absolutely false. Michael Carson never recanted his statements. Now, he apologized for testifying against Jason, but he didn't recant his statements. But that's the problem with this case to me, is like the constant bullshit from one side. Like,
and that's what the defense teams are paid to do. That's what they do. And they present their clients in the most favorable light and
right, but
try to
what I'm
create a
saying is,
narrative. That's exactly what they do in every case, because usually who they're defending are not good people to begin
no,
with.
but also the fact that they've constantly switched it. Okay, well, we didn't do it, but it was probably this guy. Okay, well,
Oh,
it
yeah.
wasn't him, it was this other guy. Now they're saying, well, it's probably not even Terry Hobbs. It's probably somebody in law enforcement. And you just go,
I haven't heard that one yet. I have not heard that. Wow.
no, and so it's just that's one of my.
And that's the problem with, I think, having all this information out there too, because you can twist it in any way you want. Almost, you can view something and you can think that is suspicious and think it points to their guilt, or you can think, oh, that shows that they're innocent. There are just different lenses to look through, and that's why this case can get so confusing, because there is so much information out there. And that's the one thing I think, I'm glad you brought it up, because I think I talked about this in our episodes, the trilogy. I mean, it just shows you how you can twist things and make one person look completely guilty and then turn around and make somebody else look completely guilty and leave out the fact that, maybe they had alibis, or it's all how you view it. It's how you curate it. It's how you narrate it. And that's what can be troubling in cases like this. And that's why no one can agree. But you make a great point about, I mean, you can twist anything to make somebody look guilty in this case. I could do it. You take anybody and try to make them look guilty.
No, but I know but I value your thoughts so much, and the problem though that I have is, if you go, well, if there's but you're seeing not just consistency in the manner of cleaning up the crime, you're seeing consistency as far as the attack on each individual.
Yes, I do. I see them all pretty consistent.
Do you think this individual would have had to have a weapon to control them?
Possibly, or controlling them with words. I think it depends on what the relationship was to the victims. This person was, I think we would tend to think in some way, shape, or form, the kids saw, and I'll keep saying person or persons, but saw the offender or offenders as a person of authority. So somebody older. How much older? I mean, an 8-year-old. I got bullied as a kid by some teenagers when I was in elementary school. They seemed like adults to me.
Right.
And it was one afternoon, and my friends and I got really bullied at a bus stop by some older girls, and they seemed really old, but they were just high schoolers, and I was young. So these boys, depending on who it is, yeah, they could have just been controlled with words, threats, possibly a weapon. Obviously, the offender had something that he used as a weapon to bludgeon them, possibly a knife for control. Those are all possibilities.
Yeah, then there's always these things that you find later on, like Damien had some walking stick where the people who moved, I think you might have told me this, and then I actually found the evidence on it, Patrick, where Captain, where the people who moved into this house in his closet, they like opened up a panel in his closet, and there's some beating stick, but it had red substance on it, but it was dog blood. It was either dog blood or red paint or something. So
the other thing too is, like, I know there's eyewitness accounts aren't like the most credible things. But when you have multiple people that claim him and Jason stomped
that Great Dane.
a dog to death, stomped its head until its eyes bulged out. It's just things like that, or the fact that he claims that he was, to get government assistance, disability, he claimed he was homicidal and suicidal. He was also not supposed to be in West Memphis because it was a violation of his parole. Damien Eccles was seeing 12 and 13-year-old girls. These are weird things, and I know that Nick holds John Douglas on this giant pedestal, but I think when he looked into the background of these three boys and said that they're not capable of committing this crime, I think he I don't know. It's
yeah. So, well, that's a good segue. That brings us to our last thing before we do our closing thoughts, because I have about 15 more minutes. But it is the John Douglas profile, and I'll be honest, I looked at it 3 months ago, and I meant to look at it today, but work stuff happened, so I haven't looked at it in a good 3 months. And I remember looking at it thinking like, oh, okay, like I could see that. But that's separate from what you're saying, Captain, is then from his book when he writes about, oh yeah, there was no like history of violence. Well, I read reports on Jesse Miss Kelly beating up multiple like younger kids, hitting them with a rock or a brick, punching one in the mouth. Like, so yeah, but as far as just a profile by itself, Julia, did you get a chance to take a peek at that?
I did. I've read it before too, and I reread it this morning. And I've read his book, but that was a long time ago, so I don't remember exactly what he said. I think Captain's right where he said there's no history of violence with the boys, or they weren't capable of it. I would never say anyone's not capable of murder.
Right.
Anyone's capable of murder, but in the profile that I read, the official report that he wrote, and keep in mind he was hired for the defense, and I'm not questioning his ethics at all, but this was done for the defense.
You are.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I'm just saying it's, you just have to keep that in mind, that this was not done when he was at the BAU. He was long retired and was brought in by one of the attorneys. But a couple things, he did not address whether any of the defendants would be responsible for this. That was something he must have done later for his book, which is a typical profile, just like we didn't address, like, detectives may come back and ask us, okay, we have these suspects, and we'd probably look at them, ask for their criminal history, say, okay, prioritize them here, number 1, 2, 3, like that, and do that. We would never say, oh, that person couldn't have done it. We just wouldn't say that.
It's dangerous. Yeah.
Right. So, but his original report indicated a couple things. Number 1, that I don't want to say I disagree with, but I disagree with that that the boys that they were low risk. And I would not consider them low risk. At least 2 of them had, at least within their family, probably there were substance abuse issues, and certainly some possible child abuse, or at least violence in their families, at least 2 of them. So that elevates their risk. And, he did point out that them being together would mitigate their risk. I agree with that, but also being in the woods where there are other people out there, transients, there are people passing through. What I mean by transients, even possibly people living out there. So that elevated their risk. So those are a couple of things that I disagreed with. The other thing, he was pretty confident, and I've already mentioned this, that the offender forced the kids to remove their clothes before he killed them. I don't feel that there's enough evidence to suggest that. So he had a complete scenario. He did believe it to be one offender. I obviously agree with that. He believed it to be animal predation versus the majority of the wounds being inflicted by a knife. Obviously, I agree with that. So, I didn't find it to be a super in-depth report, but he touched on some of those main things. Those are the things that I recall, Fig, that I could comment on. I would disagree saying, and one of the things we did not go into the history of the defendants. We really didn't go into, I mean, obviously by victimology, when did go into the histories of John Mark Byers and Terry Hobbs a little bit with what we know and what was public. But we really didn't say like, oh, this person couldn't have done it or this person did do it. But I would never say that anyone wasn't capable of it. I also agree that the boys all had histories of violence, and I would want to really study those. I've heard of them, and you guys have mentioned a couple incidents. I would really want to study those incidents before, during, and after those incidents to see, do they align with what we see in the woods? That those types of things, like, violence is, not all the same. And so you have to sort of weigh, pre-offense behavior, what happened when the violence was inflicted, and post-offense behavior, and overlay all those incidents for me to be comfortable to say, okay, who do I think would be most capable based on their past history of violence? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now you're sounding like me. So what you're saying on record is John Douglas as thorough as he should be.
Saying he was retired, he did his thing, now he's a consultant, and me being a consultant, yeah, and people are paying you for something.
I would say no, I wouldn't say that. I would just say that I don't think when we did our analysis, we could say some of the stuff that he felt confident in saying. And we did have a little bit of disagreement. Not that it really impacts anything that significantly, but a little bit of disagreement, I think, on the risk level of the victims. And I certainly don't agree that nobody's capable of violence. None of them were capable of violence. I don't agree with that.
Yeah, and like you said, that's probably more afterthought than it was in his report. Did you guys determine roughly an age of?
We really stayed away from age. We kind of went 18, typical profilers, 18 to 100.
Right.
No.
I say 18 to 40, yeah.
Eight. Yeah, you probably remember better, but yeah, we had a wide age range. The other thing I forgot with John Douglas's profile, where a couple of us would disagree, is that he felt that this was a personal cause homicide, and which I don't necessarily disagree, but he did not talk about a sexual component or think that it was sexually motivated in any way. I've already talked about why I think it could have been. But I also think, we talked about it extensively on our show. And so we didn't all see it that way.
Now I know you didn't dive into the defendants. I don't know why we call them defendants. The three teenagers that were convicted of the crimes. But have you ever looked into any of the stuff William Ramsey has done on this case?
But is he the guy that wrote a book?
Abomination.
No, I can't remember if I read that one. I read there's another book on the case. I don't know.
Blood of Innocence, the ones that
Blood of Innocence. I read that. Yeah.
That one's good.
I think I read that quite a while ago.
Because he pointed out in one of the books that Damien read that the bindings were the same, like, right hand to right foot and left foot to left foot, where you'd think that if you hog tie somebody, it's right foot to left foot, right hand to left foot to right hand, or
Yeah.
But he was saying that he believes that there, because of this book and this knowledge that Damien had, that's why they were bound the way they were bound. Do you put any validity into any of that stuff? I mean, See,
I,
I think, go ahead.
I was saying, not, I wouldn't say specifically, like I can't say, oh, that he did it. But I would say that I think whoever decided to tie them this way, I mean, there is some element of what I believe to be adjustment. You start with one knot or whatever, but they had this idea from something. Is it something they read? Is it something they saw? Is it something they learned because of a sexual fetish, or is it something they learned because of a past job? I don't know, but I think it's something that is in their history that made them tie them up in this unique way. Is it a book they read? Possibly. So I do put some weight into that. I can't say specifically. But the problem I have, and this kind of goes with a lot of the cases that I have worked on where they're high profile cases and there are a lot of different, what I call pet suspects. And some people, and they can pull from an aspect of someone's life and say CC, but then if you
Right.
were to say, well, look at this other suspect's life, he has some other things that are coincidental. So you could say, well, Damien read this book that showed um, these this mechanism of tying, but this person worked in a slaughterhouse, so therefore he had experience in that. I think you could probably do that for a lot of people in different aspects of every single case. So I'm very cautious when weighing that kind of evidence because I think you can do that with any number of suspects. As I've seen it done, I can't tell you how many how many different suspects at the time were presented for the East Area Rapist or Golden State. He's now known as the Golden State Killer, and so many similarities that matched with somebody, and obviously they all turned out to be wrong because this guy Joe D'Angelo was never even a suspect. So I'm just cautious with that.
Did you have you ever heard of the um the D'Angelo message board thing that happened?
No.
Okay, so I think this is hilarious because my father was a detective, so there's parts of the job that I will never experience. So to me, I'm always just going to be a guy I'm just the regular guy viewing this. And I feel like in the true crime space, uh, like we've covered cases before on the show where other podcasters then like contact us and they're like, that's our case. And I'm like, you don't own the case. You don't own the facts of this. And so I think sometimes in the true crime space, there's this like you can't have the answers because you're not as qualified as me. Does that make any sense? So,
Oh yeah.
so
It's not even just in the true crime podcast world. That's like in law enforcement generally. There's
I
a
think,
lot of there's a lot of possessiveness and territorialness.
well, I think I told Fig this story, but after they arrested D'Angelo, there was this message board. It was like a uh, um, original Night Stalker or whatever they called him at the time, or ears. It was like some forum, and
Earons, I bet. Yeah.
there was this guy that just was going through some pictures that his father, and his father he broke into houses and stuff, and sometimes he would work with other people to break into the houses. And so he kind of heard about these forums and just was like, hey, I'm just going to go online because I don't know anything about the case. And he was on this forum and he said, hey, you know my dad used to break into houses in this area and he worked with some people. Do you think that could be a possible lead? And people gave him a bunch of shit like, well, you come to this message board but you don't have anything. He says, well, I got some pictures. So he posted a couple pictures of his dad with a couple different people that he knew they quote unquote worked together. But when he was a kid, he didn't know his dad broke into houses. He just knew these are the people my dad worked with. Then anyways, later says, well, here's a picture of this guy. And they said, yeah, that doesn't look like somebody that could be involved in the case, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember that he gave my dad some pottery. So he found the pottery and took a picture of it. And on the bottom of him, it said D'Angelo. And he posted it to the forum. And then, of course, like people just jumped on him and basically just talked so much trash to this guy that the guy stopped coming on the forum. And then 2 years later, they solved the case. But on this forum, D'Angelo's name was on that forum 2 years before any arrest was made.
I never heard that story. That's really interesting.
Yeah, when one of my buddy told me that, I'm like, some guy that knew nothing about the case essentially solved it 2 years before.
Oh, you didn't tell me that one.
I didn't know that.
I thought you were going to talk about his micro penis. I'm glad you didn't bring that up. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think people get really offended and upset, not just, because of a certain case, but if they have a certain suspect and people disagree with their suspect, and people get really emotionally tied to their suspects. And it's not just in the true crime world, it's in law enforcement too.
Have you ever seen The Notebook?
No.
You've never seen the movie The Notebook?
I have to say no.
I have not.
Okay, so there's a scene, and this is how I feel about the West Memphis 3 cases. So Ryan Gosling's character, they part ways and then they get back together, and she's like, why didn't you write me? And he's like, I wrote you every day for a year. And he says, it's not over. It's never been over. And that's how I feel about this case, is until somebody tells me some definitive answer, I will keep looking into it, keep pondering.
Yeah. I mean, with the DNA testing, who knows what that'll turn up. I don't hold my breath for it. And even if they do turn up someone's DNA, it's really got to be weighed carefully and put into the context of the case. And, we'll see. We'll see what comes of it.
Yeah, I know we've already talked too long, but it's like there's certain cases like the John Benet Ramsey one where I'm like, I don't know if the DNA that they have right now that they think is going to solve it will solve the case. And even like with like Zodiac, like what they have, will that solve the case? I don't know, because like in the West Memphis 3 case, if you come back and say, well, we have definitive evidence that Terry Hobbs was there, well, you can make an argument that all 3 boys were in his house. And so unless it's just some unknown person that has never been discussed, it's just hard.
It's circumstantial. DNA circumstantial.
What I would find compelling, if it did turn out to be somebody who would have had a reason to have legitimate contact with the boys, I would find compelling, like, let's say there was DNA on all the shoelaces that matched a person, or the majority of them, or something, because I think that's going to be the best bet, because there's a lot of friction and tying and maneuvering the laces the way the offender did. So that's their best bet. And if you had DNA in multiple places and they were on shoelaces that came from different shoes, then I would find that a little more compelling. But
what's the likelihood when they were soaked for over 12 hours?
I'm not going to hold my breath, is the best I can say, but I've seen things come out of toilets that they got DNA off of, like cigarette butts and things like that. So, I mean, it wasn't in the water for as long as the shoelaces. So, I don't know.
Yeah, because one of the shoelaces they think was from an offender because it's so much longer, that black one, way longer than the other ones. So I'm like, that if they're going to find some DNA, it's got to be on that one, if that's likely the offenders, because one of
Yeah.
the shoes they found had shoelaces in it still. They didn't take those out. So it's like, where is
Yeah.
that one getting retested? That person probably tied that shoe multiple times, not just once.
Right. And if you had DNA on that one that was similar to some on another shoelace or to a hair perhaps that was found, then to me that would be pretty compelling. The probability of that all being transferred just goes way down. So and so that's why you have to say, okay, let's look at it in the context. You know, the one hair that is similar to Terry Hobbs is not enough evidence to make him a solid suspect or convict him. Not by any means, but you need more of it, and it needs to be in the right context.
All right. Well, unless there's anything else, I want to thank both of you for your time. It was a good conversation. We went through a lot, and I learned a lot.
Thank you.
Here are some of my final thoughts. Two things that really jumped out. On June 3rd, 1993, during his first confession, Jesse knew which boys were sexually assaulted, received genital injuries, and which boy did not. Even if he was given the information that 2 boys had injured genitals and 1 didn't, he would still have to guess which of the 3. He would have a 33% chance of being right and 77% chance of being wrong, and Jesse guessed it right. But there's more. In a later confession, Jesse described in detail how he knew which boys had received genital injuries and who did not. He stated he knew this because he wouldn't let Jason mutilate Michael Moore. Michael Moore is the same boy that he claimed in his first confession that he ran him down. And yeah, that boy was found about 30 feet away from the other boys. And Jesse's explanation of him running down that boy explains exactly why Michael Moore was 30 feet away from the 2 other boys. And Michael Moore was the same boy that Jesse was responsible for beating up and the same one that he prevented Jason from sexually mutilating. Jesse does get things wrong in the confessions. And it's hard to tell if he was trying to distance himself or just making things up to make sure that Jason and Damien were in trouble. Jesse stated multiple times in the first confession that he left early. So he distanced himself from the actual tying of the boys and when and how they were killed. I think that's why he got those things wrong in that first confession. But whether he really left before they were actually tied and killed or he just wanted to distance himself is up for debate. And also, I think why a lot of things were wrong in the confession was not only was he trying to distance himself, but also Jesse was drunk. And there's evidence of that with the whiskey bottle that was later found. He was also 30 feet away from Damien and Jason attacking the other 2 boys. So it's not like he was standing there watching everything that happened. I think he just tried to fill in the gaps, again, to make sure that Jason and Damien got in trouble. So what I think happened was, on the day of the murders, that it just started as some bullying. We could all think of a scenario where there's a mean group of boys picking on a smaller group of boys. There is group psychology, which explains the dynamic. You could tell by looking into their behaviors that Damien was the leader. He would give orders and Jason would follow. So in this scenario, Damien was the leader giving orders, dictating how things would be done. Jason and Jesse followed, pressured, influenced, caught in the mob mentality. Think of Lord of the Flies, boys together, drunk, egging each other on, feeding on aggression. There's also a phenomenon called risky shift or group polarization, when people in a group push each other towards more extreme or dangerous behavior than any one of them might have done alone. Based on reading Exhibit 500 and looking at Damien's previous behavior, he had years of violent fantasies, and I think that escalated into torture and murder. I think Damien spent years running violent scenarios in his head, waiting for the right opportunity. He admitted he went to Robin Hood Hills roughly twice a week, the same place the boys often played. I think when the opportunity presented itself where he could live out these fantasies, I think he took it. I mean, Damien showed sadistic traits. Something interesting was how he told police that the killer probably enjoyed hearing the boys scream. And the autopsy showed multiple small stab wounds, not to kill quickly, but to inflict pain, which would make the boys scream. And for Damien, I think that was sexual gratification. He had a history of killing dogs, starting fires, violent impulses. Escalation seemed inevitable. He was even blowing kisses at the victim's family at trial, a very sadistic thing to do. I thought Julia brought up a lot of good points. The consistency of the bindings was definitely interesting, and how one could think that points to one offender. I think it's good to always follow the evidence And of course, we don't want to start with the conclusion that there were 3 people involved and then try and make all the evidence work towards that. But I think if you just follow the evidence, it will lead you to 3 people, 3 different types of knots, multiple weapons used. The crime scene, for it to be cleaned that well, it's more likely that multiple people were involved in the cleanup than just one. Witness statements, that's evidence. Confessions placed, 3 people there, that's evidence. The whiskey bottle places Jesse there, that's evidence. Witness statements place Damien and Jason there, that's evidence. And Damien didn't look like some regular person. He stood out. And I think that's why this witness testimony holds a little bit more weight. There is evidence that multiple weapons were used. There was one rounded object that was large. It could have been a branch, a stick, but there was something that caused blunt force trauma. So that's one. There was also something that left beating marks, which was of a smaller size. It could have been a branch or a stick, as you could see here. That's 2. 3, there was also a knife present. A knife was used. Shoelaces got cut. We know a knife was there. You can see these marks here. It looks like the serrated knife made these marks. Also, the butt cap of the knife that was found in the lake fits up exactly here. The state of Arkansas determined that an edged weapon was used in these crimes. The fact that Chris Byers bled to death before being placed in water makes it really hard to think that there was animal predation, but I think it was a combination of both. I think there was some small animal predation, but animals did not cause the major wounds. They did not cause Christopher Byers to bleed to death. Again, that points to a knife being used, which means there's probably 3 weapons that were used, 2 at the very minimum. And honestly, I looked into this. It's not possible to determine animal predation via photograph, especially when victims are in water due to the swelling. And when a knife was used and the boys were moving around, it was a serrated blade. It looks like it dug into the boys. They were found in a drainage ditch, not an ocean, not a creek. There's very little aquatic life in a drainage ditch. I don't even think there's water in that ditch year round. And when the drainage ditch was drained after the boys were discovered, there were no snapping turtles that were found. Also, there's an official document, a statement that was given by the state of Arkansas that bladed weapons and knives were used to kill the boys, not animal predation. Determining predation from mere photographs, especially of a decomposed body, would be highly speculative without confirming evidence with microscope tissue reaction, taking DNA swabs. It's really just a guess. A lot of what we hear are experts out in the open who are paid by the defense or have some sort of bias. So I'm going to go with this official letter from the state of Arkansas. The behaviors. Damien didn't seem like he cared if he was caught or not. After the murders, he claimed to be responsible, making some incriminating statements. So why would he clean up the crime scene? Well, it's possible that maybe Jason did the cleanup. Jason fit the personality of someone who did not want to be caught. He didn't do a lie detector test. He didn't talk to the police. He didn't want to say what his alibi was. And maybe Jason pleaded with Damien to help him clean up because Jason didn't want to get caught. So maybe Damien was looking out for his little minion. Or maybe Damien didn't want others to know Jason was involved so he could look like the sole killer, the boogeyman. His idol Ted Bundy didn't have an accomplice. So maybe he wanted to paint the picture that was him and him alone. So maybe he didn't want Jason either to get in trouble or to take credit for it. Or maybe Damien just didn't want to get caught then. So those are my final thoughts. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot, and thanks for listening.